Okay, so to start off today's show, we're going to have a segment that if you listen to the Zach Kroll Sports Podcast throughout football season, we do something very similar to this on the football episodes of the show, and that is called the State of the Union. And basically what I'm going to be doing is every Monday when I record the college basketball weekend recap edition of the Zach Kroll Sports Podcast, I'm going to be starting off the show by giving you guys my top 10 observations from the first week of college basketball season. And I feel like college basketball, one of the best things about the sport is just the number of teams there are and how many different things we could talk about throughout an individual podcast episode. And I feel like in this segment, it gives me a real nice opportunity to hit on my top 10 takeaways of the week. And I just wanted to say, if your team is not being spoken about on today's episode, I'm sorry. It's just there are so many teams to talk about and not a lot of time. And I think this is a good segment to just hit on as many teams as possible. And if your team just gets a little more interesting, if your team gets into the storylines, if your team becomes relevant, I promise by season's end, you will hear me talking about them on this show. But without further ado, it's time for me to give you guys my top 10 observations from week one of the college basketball season. So without further ado, boys, hit the music. Here we go. Takeaway number one. The San Diego State Aztecs are not going anywhere because they, once again, for the second straight year, are going to be one of the best teams in college basketball. We're going to talk about the Aztecs a little bit more in depth later in the show, but I just loved how they went on the floor against a UCLA team that was favored to beat them and that was ranked and just took care of business. It took me 5 minutes watching that game to realize the San Diego State Aztecs were the better team, and Brian Dutcher and his staff deserve so much credit for the way they had their team ready in this big game against the Bruins. And even though Malachi Flynn and Yanni Wetzel and KJ Fagan are not there anymore, the Aztecs still are a team to look out for due to their depth, their versatility, and the amount of just dudes they have on that squad. Takeaway number two. Jim Boeheim needs to be quiet. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, basically, here is what happened. Syracuse opened up their season against Bryant on Saturday. And when you realize it, you think about it, Syracuse and Bryant, that's probably a game Syracuse should have. But Bryant really opened things up in the first half. They played awesome. And when Jim Boeheim was asked about how his team played in the first half, his reaction was not practicing in 14 days. You just can't play this game. They should have just canceled the game. We're not conditioned. They've got fast guys and they're pushing right by us. This is a tough game for us if we're practicing every day. We're not ready. Number one, you're Syracuse and you're at home against Bryant. So shut your mouth. Even if you are not ready, this is a game you should win. But not to mention, after the game, the coach of Bryant, Jared Grasso, he was asked for a reaction to Jim Boeheim's comments. And you know what he said? Am I supposed to give an honest reaction? Let me give an honest reaction. We gave them 5 opportunities to cancel the game. They wanted to play it. We asked to move the date 5 times. We felt the same way. And that tells me all I needed to know. Even in 2020, a year where everyone is adapting to the conditions at hand, Jim Boeheim is still not willing to do that. And you know what that also tells me? Even though before the season started, I did pick Syracuse to make the NCAA tournament, I thought Joe Girard, Buddy Boeheim, they could be one of the better, more surprising teams in the ACC. Nah, this is just going to be the same Syracuse team as usual that on Selection Sunday is going to be trending right at the bubble and that they're going to have no idea if they're going to get into March Madness or not, because that's what Syracuse does, especially over the last 15 years. I don't know what Jim Boeheim is doing complaining about a game against Bryant. Takeaway number 3, Mike Young and the Virginia Tech Hokies. They are cash money in big games. And on Saturday against Villanova, they were able to do it again. And before the season started, I picked Virginia Tech to finish 11th in the ACC out of 15 teams. And I totally understand why, if you're a Hokie fan, you're going to look at my preseason ACC rankings and say, Zach, you were down on Virginia Tech. How dare you? They just beat Villanova. And I hate to say it, but I'm not shocked that Virginia Tech beat Villanova the other night. And just because I have Virginia Tech 11th in the ACC, that doesn't mean I'm down on them. The ACC is a really good league. We saw what Clemson was able to do in their tournament against two really good teams. We saw what Miami looks like and the talent that they have. I just mentioned Syracuse. Louisville had a nice win over Seton Hall. Florida State. So there are some really good teams in this ACC, and I think Virginia Tech deserves a lot of credit. This is another big win for Mike Young since he's been the head coach of VT. If you remember, last year they pulled off the big upset win over Michigan State. But the thing is, if you're a Hokie fan, you just have to remember, we've seen this happen before, right? Last year, the Virginia Tech Hokies pulled off a monster upset against a team that no one thought they had any chance of beating. Just like this year, they beat Michigan State. Last year, they beat Villanova this year. And last year, Virginia Tech, even with that win, just faltered down the stretch and were not able to move forward, make any progress, make the tournament. Their best player transferred. So I'm curious to see if guys like Naeem Aline, who looked phenomenal in the game against Villanova, I'm curious to see if he could keep it up. Cartier Diarra looks established as one of the best transfers in all of college basketball. Could he keep it up? Wabisa Bede is out here hitting threes. Keve Aluma, the guy who played for Mike Young at Wofford, he looks like he's having some fun playing for his old coach. The Hokies deserve a lot of credit. I'm just curious to see if they could keep it up going forward. Takeaway number 4. The Richmond-Kentucky game should not have been a surprise to anyone. Number 1, I know Kentucky has so many talented freshmen on their team, but are we forgetting that this is Kentucky? And yeah, that these kids are freshmen, and they were going up against a team in Richmond that just has dudes that have played together for a really long time that would have made the NCAA tournament as an at-large last year if it would have taken place. So with all those factors being said, Richmond and their win against Kentucky didn't surprise me at the least. Richmond looked more determined. And a lot of times we spend too much time hyping up these freshmen in college basketball, right? And for good reason. I think BJ Boston and Terrence Clark and Isaiah Jackson are all going to be really good NBA players one day. But the bottom line is, when they take the floor against a team like Richmond that has some 22 and 23-year-old dudes that are not afraid of anything, that is a tough spot for a team like Kentucky. And I feel like even though Kentucky is a team that I told you guys could be the best Kentucky team since the 2015 almost undefeated squad, they still struggled against Richmond. And Richmond is a legitimately good team. The Atlantic 10 is a legitimately good league. And Coach Mooney, who not too long ago had fans on his butt about possibly moving on, he's done a really nice job with this Richmond Spiders program, and I believe going forward, Richmond could be one of the surprising teams in college basketball. They play in a league in the Atlantic 10, which is very good, and there are some very good teams at the top of that league, but we also saw last year Dayton was really able to take advantage of playing in that league, and they didn't lose a game. I'm curious to see if Richmond could do something similar. I understand that they're going to be playing with St. Louis, who had a big win over LSU during the weekend, but Grant Golden, Nate Kayo, Blake Francis, these guys could really ball, and I was so impressed with the way they came out against Kentucky. Takeaway number 5, Josh Pastner and Georgia Tech are the most disappointing team in college basketball to start the season. The Yellow Jackets are 0-2 with losses to Georgia State and Mercer. That cannot happen. And the thing about Georgia Tech is this. Last year, you may not realize it just because they weren't eligible for postseason play, but Georgia Tech was one of the more surprising teams in the ACC last year. And besides James Banks, they did bring a lot of pieces back this year. Jose Alvarado, Mike DeVoe, Moses Wright. These are guys that could play for Josh Pastner. And I remember when Pastner first got this Georgia Tech job, I was skeptical. I was like, look, this guy failed at Memphis. I'm not necessarily sure if he deserves another opportunity. And his first year with the Yellow Jackets, he won the NIT. And he really had this program going, what I thought was in the right direction. Unfortunately, though, the last 4 years really have not been good for the Jackets. And losing to Mercer and Georgia State, and I understand Georgia State is really good for a mid-major, but still, you're Georgia Tech at home against Georgia State. I just feel like that is a game that somehow, some way, you need to find a way to win. And to me, Georgia Tech, it's not like I predicted them to make the NCAA tournament or anything, but I predicted them to finish 9th in the ACC. And that's not going to sound, so special. But at the same time, that's good for the ACC. If you finish 9th place in the ACC, you're not a bad basketball team. You could find your way on the bubble. And right now, after watching them in their first 2 games, I don't think we could consider Georgia Tech anywhere close to that. Takeaway number 6. San Francisco and Todd Golden are a team to watch because Todd Golden is now one of the more young coaches in college basketball. He is a guy that, since he's taken over the San Francisco Don's job, he's done a really good job. And the former St. Mary's player, he's only 35 years old. He's in his second year as the head coach of San Francisco. And last year, the Dons went 22-12, 9-7 in conference, and were competitive with Gonzaga. And they have some players on this team. This Khalil Shabazz, he could really play. And against Virginia, we really saw what the Dons were able to do, and they deserve a lot of credit. Keep in mind, the Dons lost their first game of the season to UMass Lowell. They then beat Towson, they beat Virginia, and then lose to Rhode Island. But it's okay, because when you beat Virginia and you have an opportunity to play against teams like Gonzaga, against teams like St. Mary's and BYU in an underrated conference like the WCC, the Dons have some credit here. They deserve some credit, and they have a shot to be one of the more surprising teams in college basketball going forward. But the fact that Todd Golden, at age 35, just beat Tony Bennett head-to-head, that must be an awesome feeling for him. And we've seen many top 5 teams, top 10 teams throughout the country in college basketball go down in only the first couple days of the season. We saw it with Villanova. We saw it with Kentucky. We saw it with Kansas. But Virginia going down to San Francisco could be the most surprising result yet. And for Virginia, I'm not that worried. Just they need to be better on the offensive side of the ball. A lot of people thought Sam Hauser was going to be the savior. He had an opportunity to win that game. Unfortunately, he couldn't do it. Kihei Clark had a really good season last year. He's a really nice story, but I think sometimes we forget that offensively, he's a limited player. So in order for Virginia to be better, they're really going to just have to create better shots on the offensive side of the ball. Great job by San Francisco. Takeaway number 7. Clemson looked like a top 25 team. And keep in mind, this is a team that, before the season started, I predicted to finish 10th in the ACC. I predicted them to be right on par with Syracuse, with Miami, with NC State. And I watched them up close twice during this first couple days of college basketball against Mississippi State and against Purdue. And I understand those 2 teams aren't great. I think if Purdue makes the NCAA tournament, it will be considered a successful season for them, but I was super impressed with the way Clemson looked in both of those games. In the first game against Mississippi State, Amir Sims, who by far and away is their best player, didn't even do that much, but it was their depth that really was able to put them over the top. Alamir Dawes, Clyde Trapp, Jonathan Bayar, the freshman Hunter Tyson, all of these guys looked like big-time contributors for Clemson, and I do think that the ACC, after a down year last year, is on pace to be one of the better conferences in the country this year. Duke, Virginia, UNC, Florida State, Louisville, Clemson, Syracuse, Miami, NC State, all of these teams are going to be in the mix until the end, and watching Clemson really just take on Purdue and Mississippi State. There was never really a second where I thought they were going to be in jeopardy. And usually I'm not the biggest Brad Brownell guy, but if he has his team locked in like he did against Virginia, against Mississippi State, and against Purdue, then Clemson will be a team to watch going forward. Really nice job by Brad Brownell and company opening up their season with a bang. Takeaway number 8, Jalen Suggs could be the best freshman in college basketball. And there were a lot of people, including myself, that were really hyping up a lot of the freshmen in this class, not named Jalen Suggs. But watching him on the floor against Kansas on Thanksgiving Day, it was as clear as day to me that he was the best player on that court, and he is the guy that could ultimately put this Gonzaga Bulldog team over the top. And watching Gonzaga against Kansas, I understand the game was competitive and it was close, and Kansas does deserve some credit for that, but there was never really a moment during that game where I watched and said to myself, Kansas is going to win. Because Gonzaga was in control of the game throughout. They bring back a lot of members of last year's squad. Timmy, who looks as improved as ever. Ayayi, Kispert comes back. He could have been an NBA first-round pick. Also bring in Suggs, have some freshmen coming off the bench that could provide the Zags with some really nice depth. And I just love how Mark Few is not afraid of scheduling anyone, and he was willing to take any punch for his squad. Gonzaga opens their season blowing out Kansas, blowing out Auburn, and they, to me, right now in the country, look like they are the team to beat. As for Kansas, I don't think you're going to be too worried after this game. They didn't look great against St. Joe's. I feel like if you're a Kansas fan, that may be the thing you want to worry about. And I still think Kansas is a legit top 15 team. They just need to find a little more shot creation. And ultimately, if I was a fan of the Jayhawks, that could be my one worry. Can this team create enough offense? Because even though Bill Self is a great coach, and I do think there's plenty of talent, last year, if Kansas needed a basket, they could just throw it into Azubuike. They could just ask Devon Dotson to make a play, and I'm just not 100% sure this year if Kansas is going to be able to do that. I'm going to be curious to see when they just need a basket, where does the offensive production come from? Takeaway number 9. Another team I underrated in my preseason top 25, that's the Houston Cougars. Because I watched Kelvin Sampson and his Cougs just dominate the Texas Tech Red Raiders on Sunday, especially in the first half. In the second half, Texas Tech came to play a little bit, and I just don't think watching that game that the takeaway is, oh, Texas Tech, they were really the team they were in the second half. If you watch the game, the refs really did not help the Houston Cougars' favor at all with some questionable calls and no calls. And Texas Tech, they just looked out of sync. They looked like a team that has never played together, and ultimately this was one of my main worries for the Red Raiders. Nimari Burnett, the top freshman that a lot of Red Raider fans going into the season expected to be the lead guard, he only played 9 minutes. Joel Ntambwe, another kid that many Texas Tech fans were pretty high on, he only played 5 minutes, and right now, when I watched that game yesterday, it was clear to me that the Red Raiders had no real established roles, and that could be a problem. They're going to need Mac McClung to figure out if he's going to be a guy that needs to score 15 a game or a guy that needs to be a ball-handling point guard. Same with Santos Silva. Same with the freshman Michael Peavy. Same with Kyler Edwards. He was handling the ball a little bit yesterday, so I think Chris Beard is going to have to figure all of that out. For the Houston Cougars, though, they were the opposite. Caleb Mills, DeJon Jarreau, Marcus Sasser, Quentin Grimes looks like a totally new player from the guy he was at Kansas, Justin Gorham, and Kelvin Sampson has very quietly done an awesome job rebuilding this Houston Cougar program. We all know it. Kelvin Sampson was at Indiana. We all know what happened. It didn't end well. And since he's gone to Houston, as John Rothstein likes to call it, the Houston Redemption has been up and running. Houston is going to be in my top 25, not even the top 25, the top 10 that I will be submitting on Monday. And if you watch them play against Texas Tech, especially in the first half, it's obvious why. Now, they let their foot off the gas a little bit in the second half, but good teams find a way to win. They couldn't hit a field goal in that stretch, but Quentin Grimes and Sasser and Caleb Mills, that dude is just great with it. He is nice with the ball. His handling skills, super impressive. And after watching Houston up close this weekend, and after watching Memphis up close this weekend, Houston is the better team. It's really not close. If I'm Penny Hardaway, I am nervous about the way the top of the American Athletic Conference is playing right now. And my final takeaway, watch out for the Western Kentucky Hilltoppers, because I am just as guilty as anyone. In years past, Western Kentucky has built the same way. And this year was hesitant because over the last 2 years, they've been a team that's been very talented, but were never good enough to be an at-large caliber team. They looked really good in the crossover clash. And if you're a Hilltopper fan, the scary thing is Charles Bassey looked better post-injury than he did pre-injury. He was a guy that was moving well, he was blocking shots, he was finishing around the rim, and in a backcourt that brings in the dynamic freshman Davion McKnight and Kenny Cooper, the transfer from Lipscomb, those are two guys that I think could really help the offense run smoothly. They have a shooter in Frampton, a really good glue guy in Carson Williams. Josh Anderson and Tavion Hollingsworth are two guys that could score the ball. And I think talent-wise, Western Kentucky looked close enough against West Virginia. They looked like the better team against Memphis, and I feel like they would have won this tournament if they just didn't run out of gas against West Virginia's legitimate length and athleticism. And this is a tournament team, in my opinion. This is a top 25 team, in my opinion, and they're going to have Louisville on the road this week. Memphis and Northern Iowa are two wins that if Western Kentucky has to be competing for an at-large, they could really age well. And on the court, from that perspective, they look to me like one of the best 15 teams in college basketball. They are super duper talented.